Good evening. Good evening. Tonight, the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice continues its conversation on the multiple aspects of individual and systemic racism, which offends and injures all of us, white, Black, and otherwise. We have tried in our previous town halls to address the impact of racism on Black and Brown people. Tonight, our focus is on being white in a multicultural society. Race, as you know, is a social construct with no biological foundation, created to justify the enslavement of millions of people who were deemed different, other, naturally inferior to their captors, who found it easier to gain wealth and power through the manual efforts of other. Ironically and unfortunately, the zero-sum formula continues to plague our society and keep us divided as me's and others rather than us. While we have often used the artificial artifact of race to identify and define the others, namely people of color, we have lost sight of the fact that being white is also a racial and social construct with specific meaning, benefits, and consequences. Tonight's panel of experts will explore why white people should recognize and understand what being white in this society means and how it is perceived by others. It has negative consequences for all, especially since we share the same space and the demographic and population growth of multiple others indicate a trend towards a potential change of control, power, social, and economic status. The fears of such change can be eased if we think instead of the virtue of equality and equity for all of us. Tonight, we will also explore what white people can do to lessen the interference of the social construct, whiteness, in the accessibility and availability of equality and equity for the other. It can be done, it must be done before the divisiveness becomes even broader and more damaging to all of us. While many of us Black, white, and otherwise are working together, people of color did not create the social construct of race, but we can and we will support your efforts, that those of you who are white. We will demand change, but are dependent on you to address the issues of individual and systemic racism. Today I asked, though I know I had a panel of experts that would be speaking to us tonight, but I asked two of my friends, two of my neighbors, what's it like being white in today's multicultural society? One said, it is confusing, frightening, and uncomfortable. She asked, why do we pick on the Chinese because of the COVID virus? Why did we attack all Muslims after 9/11? Why is there an apparently different justice system for Blacks and white? What am I to think? How am I to behave? The other friend drew a diagram for me, which showed white people at the center of a circle and all others around the periphery of the circle. The person in the center was in control. Her fear is, what will it feel like if someone on the periphery gets to be center stage and I and all whites land up on the periphery? Will I experience what they have experienced for at least the past 400 years? We must ask ourselves, if this is the real fear for white people, what can they do, we do, to assure them that there is a better way? Let's turn, before we introduce our moderators for the night, and look at a film, a short video from the former New Orleans mayor on the responsibility of the white community to address racial issues. Calvin, can you show the film, please?
Racism is not something that we can go slow on. It has been with us forever, and it has been an urgent crisis since it began. And why we keep looking past it is one of the really most troubling issues to me as an American. Well, race is, as you know, this nation's original sin. We have not really found a way to bring the country together the way that our founding fathers aspired us to do. There is no way that America can be as great as she says she wants to be unless we make sure that what the founding fathers promised us is actually realized by everybody, irrespective of race, creed, or color. When you actually started to talking about race itself and white people's view of race as opposed to African Americans' view of race, mostly white people thought that race in the last 50 years was getting better. Almost every African American we talked to said no, over the last 50 years it has not. The biggest hurdle that we have is that white people who responded to our survey and participated don't really have a full understanding of what institutional racism is in the country. They think it's just an individual act of malice to another person that doesn't look like them. And of course the African American community sees this in a very, very different way. They will clearly say, and you hear this from kids in Louisville, Kentucky who are high schoolers, they said to me, Mr. Mayor, talent is equally distributed. There's no way to get around that, but opportunity clearly is not. You have schools that are segregated by race. And as a general rule, if you look at all the schools that have high tuitions, most of the people that go there are white kids, not African American kids. And schools tend to be more segregated than they used to. And academic excellence is sometimes related to how much the teachers are paid, what the resources, they have are, and they have a better opportunity. Most white people that we talked to didn't like the word white privilege. They felt like it was an assault on the fact that they didn't work hard. On the issue of reparations, most white people that responded to the survey said things like, I wasn't alive during that time, I didn't have a slave, why should I pay money back? When we, again, started talking to them a little bit more about what white privilege might really look like and used other words to describe it, like, can you ever remember getting the benefit of the doubt that maybe one of your friends that didn't look like you had? Like, if you got pulled over by the police and you didn't have your driver's license, did you get arrested or were you given a summons? What happened to your African American friends? They began to acknowledge that the system actually did treat people differently. It's not hard for people to understand that they didn't learn something the right way. What's hard for them is to acknowledge that we now have to correct it. And so to me, although it was hard to listen to how far we were apart, there always seems to me to be a pathway to common ground if you want to do it. I have been able to witness firsthand the inability of white people to really understand the life that African Americans lead. And of course, as the country continues to get more diverse, we all have to figure out how to live together, not just so that we live in peaceful segregation, so that we actually believe that diversity is a strength, not a weakness, and all of us have the opportunity to realize our God-given potential. Again, not just because it's the right thing to do, which it clearly is, but you cannot win if everybody's not on the field. The call to action is actually very simple, although doing this is really hard, and that's to see every other human being as a human being and judge them based on what's in their soul, not what their color of their skin is. It sounds so simple. It's something that we've been talking about forever, but for some reason we find a really tough time actually doing it, because doing it requires us to think in ways that we haven't been taught. That's a simple call to action, and if you do that in your personal life, and you do that in the way that you interact with everybody else in your community, the world is going to be a better place. But it starts off with whether or not you believe that we are all created equal, and whether all are endowed with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you really believe that, it ought to get us to a much better and a much more different place.
Thank you, Calvin. It's a very informative film. Let's get on though with our panel discussion, because we have some very good moderators and exciting panelists for tonight. Let me introduce the moderators who will lead us through the rest of this town hall meeting. First, I'd like to introduce Reverend Dania Griffin, who is the pastor of Antioch AME Church in Frankfort, Delaware. He has served as Kent County Coordinator for the Juvenile Awareness Education Project and director of Upward Bound at Delaware State University. Reverend Griffin is a member of the Southern Delaware Alliance's steering committee. His co-moderator, Dr. Katherine Cauley, now retired, was the director of the Center for Healthy Communities and professor of psychology at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Dr. Cauley currently serves on the advisory board of the Brian A. Stevenson School of Excellence and is an active member, very active member of the SDARJ Dialogue to Action team. Welcome, and thank both of you in advance for leading us in this difficult but necessary discussion. And I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Charlotte. Good evening. We welcome you to this town hall, Being White in Multicultural Society, the conversation we need to have. My name is Dania Griffin, and tonight we're pleased to have with us some panelists who have a broad level of experience with a diversity of experience. And I just want to go ahead and introduce them. We are pleased to have with us this evening, first, Marcel Hayes. He's a Good evening. He's a fifth generation Sussex County native, is University of Delaware graduate, and did graduate studies at the University of Baltimore School of Public Policy and Government Studies. He's a retired administrator from the state of Maryland and currently a school board member with Sussex Technical High School, as well as the chairperson of the 35th Delaware Representative District, Mr. Marcel Hayes. Our next panelist, Aaron Latta Morissette, is a New York-based actor, writer, and comedian who has starred in several short and feature films, music videos, online projects, off-Broadway productions, and more. In addition to acting opposite Academy Award and three-time Golden Globe nominee Eric Roberts in a recent short film, Aaron also worked on the LA crew for Spider-Man No Way Home, for which he's not given us any secrets. Aaron wrote and produced his first short film, The Nightclubbers, over COVID, and is now in the midst of submitting it to film festivals. Good evening, Aaron.
Thanks for having me.
Our next panelist, Dr. Michelle Wark, has degrees in education, counseling, behavioral science, and human services. She has worked for 22 years as a social worker, advocate, and therapist focusing on issues including domestic violence, homelessness, abused, neglected, dependent children, and mental illness. For the last 9 years, Dr. Wark worked in higher education and has experience as an adjunct part-time instructor for 11 years while working in the field. Dr. Michelle Wark, thank you.
Good evening.
Our next panelist, Alan Slan, earned his Juris Doctorate from American University, Washington College of Law in 1971, and retired from an executive management position with a global travel management company in 2017 when he moved to Rehoboth Beach. Here in Sussex County, Alan is active with Seaside Jewish Community Multi-Faith Committee, the DTA program, the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. Alan helped organize the Coastal Highway Rally after the murder of George Floyd and the Youth March over the Indian River Bridge commemorating the Selma to Birmingham March and John Lewis. Alan Slan, welcome.
Thank you, Reverend.
Our next panelist, Jalen Powell, is the owner and chief executive officer of Out Loud LLC. At 25 years of age, Jalen holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Master of Science in Law, with a concentration in human rights and rule of law. Jalen is a program manager for Delaware Coalition Against Gun Violence and a co-lead for the Delaware Racial Justice Collaborative's Youth and Young Adult Leadership Work Stream. Welcome, Jalen.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. Our final panelist, Shannon Hope Vela, has worked with children who had challenging behaviors. She is currently pursuing her bachelor's degree in social work at Delaware State University. She describes herself as the legacy of my elders and the keeper of their stories for the next generation. Ladies and gentlemen, your panelists for this evening's discussion. Kate?
Yes, before we actually get the conversation started, we wanted to just identify a few ground rules. One, sort of a direction for the viewers who are part of the seminar, anyone who's part of the audience this evening. If you have additional questions for the panelists, and if there is time at the to respond to those questions, we will be happy to do so. And so please type those questions into the chat if indeed you have a question that comes up. For the panelists and Reverend Griffin and I, we're expecting us all to be respectful of each other's time. We're expecting that everyone will speak their own truth. And we're looking forward to a rich and deep conversation. The format for this evening will include 3 questions, which are addressed to all the panelists. And then there will be 2 questions specifically addressed to the white panelists. And throughout that, we'll be engaging in conversation across the panel. So as moderators, we have the opportunity to continue Charlotte's work of setting the stage for the discussion this evening, being white in a multicultural society, the conversation we need to have. And as Reverend Griffin and I were preparing for this, we discovered that essentially one of the best ways to introduce this topic was to simply talk about our own stories. And so we're going to do that very briefly. And before I tell mine, I just want to say my story sounded very different before Reverend Griffin and I started working together. I've learned a great deal in this process of preparation. So my story echoes something that we heard, that many of you may have heard if you listened to the TED Talk, where Allie Michael said she hears a lot of white people say, I worked hard, I earned my own way, or slavery was back in the day and I had nothing to do with that. But then Allie says, indeed, racism is integral to me and all my family before me. I grew up in an all-white neighborhood where my college-educated parents owned their home, and as early white immigrants with what's called name heritage, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and my great-great-grandparents were all college-educated professionals who owned land because in the early 1800s, when land was taken from Native Americans in Iowa through something called the Black Hawk Purchase, my ancestors received land grants and homesteading plots, establishing them clearly as members of the highest caste in American society. Growing up, I had little to no interaction with any people of color. And as white people, we are free, consciously or unconsciously, to make that choice. I had no conscious understanding that I was living in a racist society whose caste system had a 400-year history supported and maintained by law and social custom. There was never any question that I would go to college, become a professional, own property, and live in an all-white community, as had all who had come before me. And none of this was my fault or my doing. I'm not a bad person for being white. However, having gained some understanding about what being white in America is all about, I have a vital moral responsibility to join others who want to dismantle this structure that dehumanizes my fellow travelers and to integrate myself into this multicultural society?
Okay, thank you, Kate. As Kate and I were talking, it was amazing. We discovered very quickly how diametrically opposed our experiences were. Just as she was raised in really in the essence of the ideal and traditional Rockwell version, a Norman Rockwell version of America, I was just the opposite. My experience is not typical, but it is my experience. I was born into a single parent mother household. I was raised not by a nuclear family, but it was comprised of a village of family and friends, and along the way was aided by social welfare, public housing, no home ownership. It was, and of course, I've also had some interaction with the juvenile justice system. It was a fairly unstable home life. Prior to first grade, we moved regularly. And then by the time I got to elementary school, between first and 10th grade, I had moved 8 times. And so I don't think I remember completing, but maybe 4th grade and 7th grade in the same school system. So as it relates to the topic is being white in a multicultural society. I can't speak to the being white, but I can speak to my experience in that society. And I remember a couple of things. One was when I was in the 7th grade, from 7th grade to 12th grade, I was always the only Black kid in the class. This was early integration, 1967, 68. I was the only Black kid in the class. And that gave me sort of a unique perspective. I found myself early on trying to decode what the teacher meant when she said over and over again, he's the best one in our class. I knew I wasn't a straight A student. So, and I hadn't gotten the concept of what race really was at that point. So when she said best one, it was like, she's lying to somebody about me. But that was my introduction. It took me to that whole first year to understand that she wasn't talking about me being the best student. I was the best Black student that she had experienced, and the only Black student that she'd experienced, at least during that time. Another experience was I was sitting in a French class in high school. And again, this is 67, 68. The French instructor said to the class, I don't know why you would worry about who used your hits. You remember in old, Jalen, you might not know about this because now we do earbuds and stuff. But back in the day, we had headsets, and you learned French through the headsets.
Yes.
And apparently there had been some issue that I wasn't aware of where the teacher simply said, I don't know why some of you are worried about who used your headset before you. Again, I'm the only Black kid in the class. And by then I had some awareness that she was talking to the white kids about me or people like me. So I've had, there are other examples, but I just want to kind of put for discussion on the table that there's a difference of perception. And I just want to give my context of what it's like to be in a multicultural society, not from the white perspective, but we're being a Black person that's experiencing that. And I'm hoping that as we continue this discussion, that's kind of what we'll get to do from all sides. Look at this, flip it over, look at it, and then maybe come to a conclusion there are some things that we can do. And I'll stop there. There's more we can add later. Now,
Okay.
so having,
Go ahead.
yeah, okay. Having started there, my first question begins with Mayor Landrieu said in the video that we watched, we, especially white people, need to own and accept the role of racism in our lives. We need to know the facts, know the history, recognize this is inadequate, and work to change it. All parties have to be engaged in the process of change. With this in mind, we're going to engage our panel in discussion around several questions. So I'm going to ask, first of all, to the white panelists, to Dr. Wark and Alan and to Aaron. What does it mean to you to be white? Nope, let's start with Dr. Wark, since you're first on my screen.
Thank you, Reverend Griffin. I think in terms of what it means to be white, it's not something that I ever thought about until I really was in adulthood. And I recognize what a position of privilege that is. I didn't think about my race in terms of everyday interactions or society, because I was always in a position of privilege and majority. I had a similar upbringing actually to Reverend Griffin's. I had working class parents. They owned one home, which they lost to foreclosure, and never owned another. And there was a tremendous expectation that I would get married and have children, and college was not something that was expected or foreseen for me. So there was a lot of working class beliefs that were very integrated into my growing up. I count myself quite fortunate that because I had working class parents and because we lived in communities that were quite integrated, that I had the opportunity to interact with folks from lots of different cultures. And I can remember being 16 and I was going to homecoming with a friend because I was not in a relationship, and my friend happened to be an African-American male. And we went in a group, but he was my kind of dance partner. And I can remember my parents sitting me down and saying to me, Michelle, we like him and we have no concerns about this, but we want you to know that some people in the neighborhood have been making comments. And I remember the shock that, you know, why would anybody make comments? And it wasn't until many years later that I really understood what they were trying to say to me at the time. And it's not just the big institutional racism that we talk about every day. We know that it's there. We can track it with numbers. We can see the differences in lots of areas. It's the nuances and the small racism that we miss frequently, and things that I've worked much harder to be aware of and to try to give voice to.
Thank you for sharing. Alan.
Yes, Dr. Griffin, yes. I have to say that much of what Michelle said rings so very true to me. My parents were first-generation Americans. Their parents escaped anti-Semitism that was rampant in Eastern Europe. They never went to college. And I grew up in a basically working class family. My father became reasonably successful, but not wealthy by any means. But it gave me advantages along the way. And so I never thought about myself as different from anybody else because of the color of my skin. It just didn't show up for me. What did show up for me, I'd say, is the issue of racism. I was attracted very early on to the civil rights movement. And I would say now, at the ripe old age of 75, that my white privilege, if you will, has provided me with an open and unfettered platform to speak out.
when I see speak out against hatred and racism and white supremacy. So it has given me that opportunity, but it has also provided the obligation. And I will take that up. I have taken it up, and I will continue to take it up.
Thank you for sharing. Aaron, what does it mean to you to be white?
I definitely mirror a lot of the sentiments that have been offered thus far. It's interesting hearing it through the perspective of all of our different experiences growing up, or just living life in general. I guess for me, it's growing up because I'm still so young, but that's what I look back on. But for me, it's like what Michelle said, not having to think about what it means to be white. Growing up, I have lesbian parents and I was raised Jewish. So we were told like there are groups of people that are not going to like you for a lot of reasons. If they're like, you know, thinking that way, that has nothing to do with you, and you do not treat other people that way. So that is not how we work in our family, basically. So growing up, it wasn't really a thing we talked about. It was like, just be a good person regardless. So I think now, which goes hand in hand with being a philosophical 20-year-old, I think being white today means, for me at least, that I ask why a lot. So like, instead of just going out at night and meeting up with friends or whatever I want to do, now has the added question of, well, why am I able to not worry about this, or why am I able to go and do that? And I think it does go hand in hand with my upbringing, and like having supportive parents means my life is great, but you know, being white also gives me an advantage that I wasn't aware of for a very long time. So I think having the world kind of turn into a mirror and upset a lot of people who are white and being like, well, this means it's an attack, as opposed to, well, no, now we're just seeing, like, when I walk down the street, I'm walking on top of like a system that has been propping us up. We don't realize how high we are right now in compared to other people. So I think it's our job right now to just open our eyes a little bit more. At least that's how I see it.
Okay.
Thank
Very
you
good.
all.
Thank you. Yes.
And now turning to our Black panelists, I'm curious, I'm going to start with Marcel because he's first on my screen. Marcel, what does it mean to you to be Black?
To respond to that, it means that there's an obligation on my part. My parents there was a nuclear family for me. My mother, father, they worked, hardworking. They were union workers. There was an obligation. I will give you an example of being Black and growing up. My first 2 years in elementary school, I should say, growing up as a kid, I only went to school half a day. This was first grade, simply because we were overcrowded. This is back in 1968. I'm getting in my 60s as well. There was an obligation by my mother, my father, to make sure that we had an education. We were obligated, in a sense, to go to college. I could give you an example that in high school, there was like a PTA meetings. And of course, the only one parent came to that meeting, and it was my mother. She was concerned, how's my son doing? There was an obligation on her part to make sure that we were getting educated. So there was an obligation. That's what I would say is a part of my growing up being Black, an obligation to excel no matter what, no matter who, no matter when.
Thank you. Jalen, what does it mean to you to be Black?
Just in short, paraphrasing, I guess, for me, it's accepting a life playing defense. Constantly having to defend your emotions, your qualifications, defend that you're not a threat, defend your history, your truth, now in your life. It wasn't just enough for us to show up to school. We had to show up to school and get straight A's. It wasn't enough for me to go to college. I need to get the bachelor's and the master's degree. It's not enough for me to follow what the officer says. I need to follow what he says, call somebody, record, make sure I ask before I move, make sure he can see my hands, make sure I'm making eye contact with him. I had to do extra, and I was taught to do extra, because in the world that we live in, being Black is something that the world has mandated you to do. I can't just play offense. I can't just chill and be myself. I have to constantly be on guard. I have to constantly look at my surroundings. I have to constantly be aware of what's going on. So in a nutshell, for me, being Black is playing defense every day of my life.
Wow. Thank you. Hope, what does it mean to you to be Black?
My history, I was an Army brat, so I grew up all over Europe and all over the United States. I'm a child of the 60s. Most of the time when my brother and I went to school, if we weren't the only, we were one of the few children that looked like us. And we weren't, I agree with Jalen, we were expected to be better because our parents knew that the world was looking at us, expecting us to fail. I didn't understand why different people liked me, because my parents had taught me Black is beautiful. So if someone said something about my color, I thought they were complimenting me as a little kid. But I was old enough to read the faded out signs. I was old enough to wonder why we only drove to my dad's changes of duty stations. We never, if he had to go inside a gas station, he parked on a side. I knew what the green book was. I knew to look for SO gas stations because, and now I know as an adult, it's because it was safe. I had my elders of Seminole and African descent telling me the stories as I grew up. So I already, I learned that that there were traumas in our history, but I also learned that I could succeed, and they expected me to succeed. And I was not only to succeed, I was to take others with me.
Very good. Let me ask everybody. This is a question for everybody. Did anyone hear anything that surprised them or that you hadn't heard before? Anybody? Let me preface that by saying we really want to have this discussion where we talk with each other about things that we did or did not know. Things that might just be that little aha moment. So did anybody hear anything that surprised them from any of the other panelists?
From Marcel Hayes' standpoint, no, there was not. I heard that that a family was upset, I should say, questioning the male acquaintance that she was dating at the time, his race, and it still prevails to this day. There was always that question that was out there. Is he good? Is he from a good family? What is his intentions? What does he want to do? And things of those lines. So it's always out there. So there's nothing new. I've heard that, and Jalen was very poignant in that she's always on defense. I'm always on defense. As an administrator, with subordinates, I had to be on defense on every occasion when there was a reprimand. I had to be on defense to prove myself on every occasion, what my abilities were. So there's nothing new that I heard, though, but I do appreciate their viewpoints as well.
Dr. Michelle, if it's okay. Can I ask a question? Was it that the status of that African-American male, was it just the fact that he was African-American that was the issue?
I'm quite sure that it was, in retrospect, because he was from a good family and we went to the same school and his family worked hard. We were all working class folks. So, his family worked hard. He had both parents who were at home and they were married and he had siblings and they all went to school and went to church on the weekends and, you know, did all of the right things. So I'm quite sure that the issue was strictly one of race. And my parents worked hard to let me know that it wasn't their issue, and I never heard them treat anyone differently or use any kind of racial term. But they were very well aware that other people in the neighborhood were not happy about it. And I guess many years later, my mother confessed to me that one of the neighbors had kind of cornered her and really given her a hard time and said some really awful, ugly things and threatened her because she was behaving in a way that they did not appreciate or approve. I want to say I'm not surprised by anything that anyone said, but I appreciated Jalen's comments for a couple of reasons. And I really think that's exactly what I meant when I said the nuances of white privilege. I don't have to worry about being the best at things. I didn't have to worry about how I was dressed or presenting myself every second of the day. I don't have to worry about it even now as a middle-aged woman. I don't hesitate to go walk around my neighborhood at night. And I don't have to think about that. And understand, and something that Hope said about, inherited traumas, and that this is not today's experience. This is generation after generation after generation of experience, and the toll that it takes in terms of load and anxiety. Thank you. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate you both bringing that home.
Anybody else care to respond?
Yeah, Reverend Griffin, I'll respond. I probably don't have anything particularly different to say, but because I wasn't surprised by anything I heard from Hope or Marcel or Jalen, and but each and every time I hear that, it is so painful to listen to. And I've just never been able to understand really the equanimity that surrounds people of color as they have endured all of that. I mean, I guess, in some respects, what choice do you have? But on the other, if I were to put myself in your shoes, which I know I never can, never will be able to do, I'd be beside myself. I'd be outraged. I'd be crazy. I'd be striking out. Yeah, so no surprises. No surprises.
Dania, I just wanted to comment that somebody in the audience, and one of the viewers mentioned something that she was surprised that was clearly missing from the white panelists and from my comments as a white person, which is growing up in a family where there was overt racism, in a neighborhood where there was overt racism, where people called people horrible names all the time, where it was just a constant drumbeat of how terrible Black people were and how you had to be careful, et cetera. So I just wanted to add that component, because I think that, as the person who added it, is incredibly difficult to unprogram. And I think it's both conscious and unconscious. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. Kate, you have a question? Oh,
Sure.
me again.
Actually, no, did I see that Hope had a comment to make? I'm sorry, I might have interrupted Hope.
I was adding on to Michelle about generational trauma. I spoke about my childhood and what race looked like, but I didn't speak as a mother, and how nobody taught me to teach my son, starting about at 2 years old, When you go in a store, you don't touch anything you're not going to buy. If you're going to buy it, you put it in the shopping cart. If you put it in the shopping cart, don't touch it until you pay for it. You pay for it in the back of the store. You put it in a bag, you tie it up, you keep the receipt in your hand until you walk out of that store. That wasn't taught to me. And it's not unusual. I don't know if any other panelist on here that is brown skin would say that they don't see that or weren't taught that way because people were watching us. That still goes on. My son is 35. I still will not walk out of the store without the receipt in my hand. Not because I've ever stolen anything, but because of who I am.
Can I just go ask from what you just said, Hope? I thank you for sharing that, because I want to ask the white panelists, have you ever found yourself in a position where you felt you had to prove that you were rightfully in possession of something as you walked out the store? Did you ever feel like you had to prove it? You had to have a receipt in your hand. Did you ever have to have a bag that says that you purchased something in the store? Just generally speaking, have you ever had to experience that?
I haven't.
Did anybody ever have to worry about whether they were wearing a hood over their head or a hat that covered their eyes, or if there was a bulge in their pocket? No. Okay.
No.
Go ahead, Marcel.
To respond to that, I would say yes. On every occasion that I have gone to a store, that's any clothing store, grocery store, whatever. As a Black male, and again, this is not from my perspective, someone who's 6'2", 280 pounds I am perceived as a threat, first and foremost. And I carry myself in a way to show people that I am not a threat, that I am a human, that I did not come here to threaten you. I just want to be accepted for who I am as a person. So yes, on every occasion I come to, I've been across store surveillance. Who is he? What is he doing? And of course, when I have my blue card, I can, or whatever, American Express card or whatever it would be. And when I used to drive my big sports car around town, they were like, "Oh, he's okay," And this is coming from a city that I used to work in Baltimore. Again, there's issues with the
I think Marcel's frozen. I do want to ask, if I can, Kate. Eventually I want to go back and touch base with Jalen, but right now I do want to ask a question. Moving conversation forward, how do the laws and social customs related to race in this country have an impact on white people, do you think? Just at first, and I think I'm asking everybody, is that right, Kate? I just want to make
Absolutely.
sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, I just want to make sure. And I like to hear response because of the topic. I want to begin with responses from our white participants, and then to the Black participants.
Could you repeat the question, Dania, just one more time?
How do the laws and social customs related to race in this country have an impact on white people? And I might even throw a little twist in and say for white people, And let's start with our white panelists, and then we'll go to the others, the Black panelists.
Reverend Griffin, I'll take a shot at it.
Go right ahead.
I have become a strong proponent and believer in Heather McGhee's zero-sum game theory that she articulates in her amazing book, The Sum of Us. And in essence, she postulates through the book and by example that this zero-sum thing basically is, if you get something, I lose something. or if I lose something, you get something. And that has been really the hierarchical condition that has been brought about by our laws and customs and all the things that you tossed out there. But the thing of it is, and as she says, we all lose when that happens. We all lose when that happens, and it's only the very wealthiest of us, that 1% or so, who gain by each of us losing something. So to spread out the equity of all the resources we have and all the opportunities we have, to state it in the positive, we would all gain by it.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's very profound. Somebody else.
I'd love to say, Alan, I think that you said something really important in terms of the idea of the scarcity mindset. You know, we were all raised with this, and I'm thinking about Kate's example, or no, I apologize, Miss Charlotte's example of the neighbor who drew the circle and put white people at the center. And the whole time she was talking about that, I thought, oh my goodness, you know, that the ego and the privilege of the white people at the center of the circle. And I'm thinking, listening to Alan, how it's reflected again in the idea that there's, you know, scarce resources. And if I give up my privilege, then someone else is going to get it. And the goal of dismantling racism is not to give someone else privilege, it's to create a playing field where people's diversity can be respected and everyone can gain based on their strengths. And you know, Reverend Griffin asked specifically about laws and social policy, and I taught social policy, so I can give lots of examples of how, you know, rules and laws have been made to create a disadvantage that encourages institutional and structural racism as it continues. And, you know, the example that I always think of is the man in the house rules from welfare. So you couldn't get welfare benefits if there was a man in the house. Didn't matter if it was the father of your children. If there was a man in the house, you could not get benefits. So what happened was that we put people in a position when they needed help to either lie and to get their neighbors and their family members to lie for them, because back before the internet, they had to actually have people speak to the social worker or sign forms saying that it was true. Or we separated families and created more poverty. And social policy in our country, which is mostly guided by legislation, continues to do the same kinds of things. You know, think about the 3 strikes you're out laws, and who is overwhelmingly impacted by 3 strikes you're out laws? Drug offenders. Who is overwhelmingly impacted by that? And, you know, we continue to have this, and we keep having the example, or we keep getting this example of white fear. White fragility has become kind of the term that we use for it, but it really is white fear. And it's based on that idea that if I let you, there's privilege. If I let you have equal footing, then I lose something. And it was so beautifully reflected in that example earlier with the diagram and the circle.
Just the fact that there was a note in the chat earlier, and I think Michelle was in response to when you talked about your friend and that he was from a good family. And then it was something that when you said who mostly gets impacted by the three strikes you're out laws. And once again, you said it was a drug offender. I don't want to know. I didn't know whether you were creating equivalency between good families and, I guess, white families, or drug offenders and black families, those kind of things. Could you kind of say a little bit about that?
Sure. So my friend, of course, was African American, and his family was a good family by terms, and I'm using my parents' definition of good family.
I got you.
So good families are people who work and who maintain their household, take care of their kids, send their kids to school, do the right things according to those, you know, that Protestant work ethic, that white working class work ethic that I grew up with.
So with the good family, you're just referring to your family's definition of what they perceive to be a good family at the time, your parents. Okay.
Correct.
Just want to clarify that for the person who wrote that in the chat.
Thank you. And I'm not sure that that their opinion of a good has changed. And
that takes us all the way to Kate. I think I think you're up, but that takes us to really what I think the purpose of our conversation is this evening.
Well, I think too, I also want to hear from others on how the laws and social customs related to race in this country have an impact on white people. I think we haven't heard from all of the panelists, so maybe I would call on Jalen.
Hi, Kate. I won't speak to how it affects white people because I don't identify. I don't want to speak for a group I don't identify with, but I can definitely speak to how it affects Black people or Black and brown people. I know someone mentioned in the comment about Native Americans. I am half Native American and half African American. So, of course, given history, laws of the land are good. We need it for order, don't get me wrong, but for me, I personally don't feel inclusive in any of the laws currently until the 21st century, or just given last year when more laws were being implemented or even discussed or formed to include the Black and brown community. And an example that I give all the time is when you take the United States Constitution, we the people of the United States of America, it was not inclusive to your Black and brown nor your Native American communities. So for me to stand by a US Constitution for America that did not include me, it's hard for me. Then when you get to the 13th Amendment, which supposedly abolished slavery, but then you of course had to implement due process laws to protect those persons that are now quote unquote free, you know, it doesn't give me assurance that laws protect me. Then when you get to the first state of Delaware, where we hold our pride on being the first state to ratify the United States Constitution, but nobody talks about how 30 years later, we were the last state to abolish slavery, to sign the amendments to abolish slavery. So when it comes to laws and how it affects Black and brown people, I mean, even if you want to get into quantitative data and talk statistics, you look at Delaware having 23% African American or Black and brown communities, then you look at their prison population and they're carrying over 60% of the prison population. So when you look at laws and policies and constructs for a Black and brown person, while you want to be hopeful that House Bill 198 bringing in African American history, you think that's going to help. When you have the Senate bills enforcing body-worn cameras, when you want to be hopeful with all these policies being made, given the history, I'm always think, well, we're going to have to add another law a couple years later. We're going to have to add another law a couple years later, because those protections don't protect us. To me, America always finds a loophole around things, and that's why we keep having to make these policies, because the system that we're trying to amend, to me, if you want to have a system in place that's equitable for all, you need to dismantle the system that was not inclusive for all to begin with. So.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Marcel or Hope, though Jalen appropriately identified that it's difficult to answer if you're not a white person, I'd be curious about your opinions on how you think laws and social customs have an impact on the white community, if you'd be willing to answer.
Certainly. My apology again. I'm on the road on a business trip and my internet just completely went down from the hotel. So my apologies again.
Welcome back.
It was a frightening experience being a panelist and then not having internet. I will give you one recommendation, SB 100, the legalization of cannabis. It failed in Delaware. And it failed for a number of reasons, most of them political, of course. The bill itself, from the scrutiny of it, was an opportunity for those with one strike, two strikes to finally get an economic step up. Unfortunately, the federal government still does not recognize marijuana as being legal. So you can't have one where it's legal, then the federal government say, no, it's not legal. And of course, the stigmatization of you're a pothead or something along those lines. But SB 100 is a clear example of racism. It was intended to give a step up to everyone. 60% of the incarceration are African-American males. And the statistics, and again, I feel that good 20% are for drug related. First-time strikers, marijuana in the car, smoking marijuana, something along those lines. So that is a stigma that that should have been addressed with that bill, but it was not.
Great example, thank you. Hope, any other comments to make before we move on?
I think because, I grew up in diversity and my son was, raised pretty much in diverse neighborhoods and diverse schools. It has been striking. His best friend since kindergarten looks like a negative of him. And his best friend can be driving the car, do something wrong, get stopped, and they're shining the light on my son. They're asking questions to my son. If the laws were applied equally, if they were enforced equally, if a drug charge was a drug charge, no matter what the color of the person's skin, no matter what the socioeconomic class of the person, when someone is getting more time for smoking marijuana than somebody for dealing cocaine, it's not equal. And that's why it's hard for young people like Jalen to trust in the system. It's why it breaks my heart that we have thought that we were moving so much further. It breaks my heart as a mother. It breaks my heart as your elder, Jalen, that we haven't done more, that we're not doing better. But this is the first step.
Thank you. I just wanted to check in with Aaron. Did you want to respond at all to that question about how do laws and social customs related to race in the country have an impact on white people?
Truthfully, I don't see a way to articulate it more in a deeper way than the way it's been stated already.
Okay.
The only thing that came to mind to me didn't have much to do with laws. It was just an example. When I first kind of became aware of the unknown subconscious prejudices that we as a society hold is in Malcolm Gladwell's Blink book. And he puts a list of attributes, wealthy, kind, educated, stuff like that, and then just headshots of different people, and explains how when you do the test across the board,
Yeah.
no matter what ethnicity you are, you tend to put any person of color and any minority with negative attributes, with white people with positive attributes. And I mean, if we want to bring it back to like my field, like Hollywood, yeah, exclusively white. I want, like, for the first 100 or so years, and like it's just now starting to change in a different direction. But like watching old Humphrey Bogart movies, the main protagonists are always Mexican. It was always anti-Mexico in all these movies. And then like if a black person has a role, they're just the shoe shiner. They say like all aboard once. There was not this platform to say these are equal people, and they weren't being treated as such. And at this point, I mean, we're just now starting to have the conversation to be like, well, that's not okay. And the fact that it's taken this long is not okay. But so yeah, I can't really add much to the law side of it, but that's what I had percolating amidst the conversation.
Sure, thank you. Dania, why don't we go ahead and move to your next question?
Okay. Again, trying to draw down on the topic, being white in a multicultural society, the conversation we need to have. I think this question really kind of just kind of draws out the fact, what are or have been the opportunities for you being white? I think you've kind of addressed it in a way in our conversation. Are there anything you want to add to that question? What have been the opportunities for you of being white? Anything you want to add to what you've already added? Any of the white folk? And I do understand. Before I say that, before, and I am asking of course of the white participants first, but I do want to say that I'm a black man in America too. I'm like Marcel. I'm 6 feet tall. I weigh anywhere between, depending on which salad I eat or don't eat, 250 and 305. Okay, you know, I walk in the room sometimes, and I know, and believe it or not, the fact that I now use a cane has actually made me less threatening. So people have been more welcoming to me. But I used to have to wear a pink sweater, so I understand those pieces. But I believe, and I'm with all of you, Jalen, I'm really with your expression of frustration, because if you've lived 67 years, you know what it is to be frustrated in situations. I had a white friend where I actually asked, he said, well, I don't get what it is with black people. I said, you know, the difference is for me that being white, you don't have to question whether or not you can go into a bar, or whether you have to check the room before you sit down, those kind of things. So I understand all of that. But I think drawing down on the need to have I made a note in the beginning that we want to have a conversation, an exchange, where maybe we can identify some things that we can work on. Having said that, that's workable for all of us. We know what all the don'ts and the ain'ts and the can'ts are. We all feel those. But in this conversation, can we find some do's and identify some areas? And so the question is, what are or have been opportunities for you being white in our society? Let's start with Aaron, since you spoke last. Let's let you speak first.
There have been some opportunities from being white. What comes to mind is like every step of the way in my life. It doesn't seem like I really faced many hurdles, and there's absolutely no way that has nothing to do with my race. So opportunities that have arisen, I mean, like in my field, like we talked about a second ago, it's I am like the prototype for a main character. I'm white, I have a hairline and a smile, like every single film, like we need one of you, not 10. And I noticed that more. I keep bringing it back to this because it's the only thing I really have knowledge about, so excuse me, but like every TV poster, every film, like a huge percentage, it's an all white cast, or you get shows that are all black cast, all Hispanic cast. Like they're just like, and it makes sense, like the inclusion of like one stock minority character just to add some like color to the group. Not only is it obvious, but it's a painstaking reminder of like our circles are really closed off in ways you don't really want to admit a lot of the time. So for me, I felt like opportunities that have come up has really been what we've been saying, nothing new, like not having to worry or not have to even think about it, truthfully. Just, I want to go do this. Okay, well, I'm going to go do it, as opposed to like, well, what are going to be the several hurdles or roadblocks in my way, was just not a part of it. And I thought growing up, it was due to having loving, supportive parents, or being in middle class. I didn't have to worry about money so much, like stuff like that, as opposed to like, oh no, this is very much a matter of skin color as well, because we were raised like just not to consider that as a thing that we included, I guess.
Mhm. Alan.
Yeah, well, you know, I think I can say without hesitation that as long as I possessed in any particular situation the requisite intellect and skill or wherewithal, and by the way, that didn't always exist for me, there was no bar. There was nothing standing in my path. Certainly, the color of my skin didn't stop me from moving forward. And so I've never experienced that type of prejudice. Nothing's held me back.
Nothing.
You know, I should say just real quickly to some of the comments that I think that Jalen was making, an opportunity of being white is I am never noticed. I can walk through the world, not ever worrying about whether I'm seen. Sorry, I just wanted to interject that.
Michelle. Not Michelle. Yeah, Michelle. Where are you? There you are.
I would echo what everyone else has said. I never had to think about my race as a potential barrier because it was never a potential barrier. And in terms of the do's and what we can do, I think that we have to start by accepting that racism is a white problem. Racism is not a Black problem. Racism is a white problem. And I think about the quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates in Between the World and Me, and he talks about, racism is not the child of race. And he goes on to talk about the hierarchy and the creation of, it's always been about, the elevation of one race over another. It has never been about inherited genetic characteristics. It has never been about that. And he says that so beautifully and so profoundly. And, I remember reading that and realizing right then that it is my responsibility. It's not just white people's responsibility. I have to take ownership of that. It's my responsibility. What am I going to do better? What am I going to do to make a change? What am I going to do to recognize my part in a system that continues to perpetuate my own elevation? And how am I going to use my voice to elevate voices that matter? And, that's my big, what do I need to do? And, I'm very grateful to the Alliance and to the many programs that they have offered, Dialogue to Action and the White Ally Small Group, where I am learning that it is, it's a white privilege for us to look at other white people who behave in a way that is inappropriate and to just light them up or blow them off. That's me exerting my privilege. I need to do better. I need to talk with them and help them to think about their own beliefs and maybe actually make some kind of small inroad to change.
Dania, I really like the direction that you started us on, rather than looking at that question about costs of being white, because I think that's kind of rhetorical. So can we just ask the whole panel, given what we've learned and heard tonight about experiences of being white in a multicultural society and being Black in a multicultural society, and about the incredibly rigid structure of institutionalized racism and the caste system and the 400 years of history that we all know, most white people know so little about. What can we be doing, as Michelle suggested, not just as white people, but certainly I want to put the emphasis on what can white people be doing. And I'm curious to hear from everyone on the panel. It's a white problem. We have to take responsibility and start taking this down. What can we be doing?
Kate, can I start?
Absolutely, Jalen, take it away.
First, I do want to clarify, while yes, there is a big frustration, anger, all of that, there is nothing that has been so hard or tolling in my life that we want to put on a different pair of shoes. And I say that because being African American, Native American descent, I know during these panel discussions, we talk about hardship, we talk about the trials, the tribulations, but for me, I do want to note that it's liberating for me. I am happy of my history. I'm happy of the journey. You got my Native American pup who taught us the value of $1. He's working 7 days a week, sun up to sundown. He's a farmer. He's growing his tomatoes, his cantaloupes, his corn. He's hunting in season. He's fishing. He's hunting deer. He's hunting rabbit. We have my African American grandmother who only got an 8th grade education, then later had to get her GED, but having a conversation with her, you would think she was a scholar got her bachelor's or master's degree. You can't even tell the difference. So the hardship for me, seeing how they took those lemons in life and made lemonade and then instilled and developed and produced warriors out of us, I don't want it taken lightly that while hard, there is nothing that I'm not proud about with my heritage, with my history. 400 years later, we're still fighting. And this fight, and I know we said it's a right problem, but it's both. You know, Carter G. Woodson said to be nominally free, but economically or mentally enslaved. Us as Black and brown people, we still have to get out of that enslaved mindset. We still have to educate ourselves. We still have to do our part. And I take huge accountability and self-reflection on myself. I studied politics. I studied human rights. I saw what was happening to Black and brown people, and I was so comfortable in it because to me that was norm, and I was willing to go through the rest of my life accepting that until 2020, when you had George Floyd immorally and unruly and unjustly murdered, and I said, wait a minute. This is not supposed to be normal. I can't go through life studying. And to me, it's not a surprise, but it's like, well, what are you waiting for? Why aren't you doing something to help your people? Why aren't you doing something to make an impact and make a difference? So us as Black and brown people too, we have to hold ourselves accountable. It's our problem too. It may not have been our responsibility. It may not have been our fault and what was done to us and how history has happened to us, but we have a mandated responsibility for the healing and liberation that must come from what was done and from what we didn't have a choice in, because now we do at least have options. We do at least have opportunities. It may not be equitable opportunities yet, but it's opportunity. So while we're having these conversations, I don't want white people, and anybody that knows me knows my family is multicultural. I have white, Puerto Rican, Native American, all that. I don't want white people to feel like this is just their problem. Come to us. We can tell you about some experiences. We can empathize with you. We can share some things and I can learn from you. I learn from my white family all the time. You know, it's things that's what equity is, when we can all come together and have these conversations. So when you ask, what can you all do as white people? One, be open to conversation. That's the first thing. And when I say open to conversation, I mean, don't come into conversations even thinking about a response. Just come to listen. Just come to digest. Just come to let it soak in your spirit and just hear the experience. Take that moment. When we had our walk of change in Milford, Delaware last year, we took 8 minutes and 46 seconds 400 people, 400 plus people, all walks of life, to just kneel in silence and just sit in that moment and empathize off of one experience that affected us all. So when you can take moments like intimate moments like that and have conversations, transparent conversations without judgment, that's where real change can be made. And for us Black and brown people, enter those conversations with patience. That's one thing that I have had to learn in this fight. Be patient. Understand that some white people don't know, and we can't fault them for not knowing, but come into the conversation open to educate, open to work towards real solutions. So that's, my spiel. I don't want to ramble. I could go on, but we should definitely work together and to paraphrase everything.
Thank you, Jalen. Excellent. Others?
How do you follow that? Yeah. I couldn't even repeat what Jalen said. But I will say that I have intended to devote myself to simply getting to know my neighbor. And I know that I haven't along the way. And I mean, really get to know the people in my community. I think that will break down a huge number of barriers, just getting to know each other as human beings.
Thank you, Alan.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else?
From my perspective, is I agree with Jalen a whole lot. My perspective is that we need a seat at the table. I appreciate the Alliance's efforts here. We need a seat at the table, and I'm always part of the political process person. We need to vote. We need to involve ourselves. Issues such as with George Floyd, the first thing that came out was that a suspect was under duress. This is from the news associations. We need a process of having a seat at the table, be it at the legal level with the courts, the political with getting people elected, or the economic level, getting jobs out there for us. So yes, that's my perspective there. And again, I thank Alan, Aaron, and Jalen as well. So thank you.
Thanks. Hope, did you have a comment?
I did. I was thinking about when you asked this question, I was thinking about Alan and I having a conversation in a meeting. And I was saying how the things that I was saying, brown skinned people, we knew, you didn't see anybody's mouth fall open about me having to teach a 2-year-old how he had to act because of the color of his skin. We have those conversations in isolation without, back all the years I was growing up, Jalen, we did not have those conversations in mixed company. If we saw something and we felt that it was directed at us because of our skin color, we would be received as, it's not that problem. It can't be that problem. My one and only EEOC complaint was from a boss that would not let me put money in his hand. I could not touch him. He was so outrageous that customers were complaining. Staff would try to stick up for me. By the time I went to EEOC, they said, well, you have to have people to corroborate your story. And I gave them a list of 15 people. And they said to me, at least half have to be white. Well, it turns out he had ran off every brown skinned person besides me. So they were all white. So, and I didn't used to tell people that story because I took that on as my shame. So I will have these conversations with people. I will tell of my experience because it's rich, and it isn't one of being a victim. It's one of having victory, of my ancestors being the phoenix, and a phoenix doesn't stay in the dust. But if you can't, I don't really care what color someone's skin is, if they cannot listen to my experience and accept it as my experience and not look at it past the mirror that they've got in front of their own face, I'm not going to, I can't entertain that anymore, because I've got a responsibility to Jalen. I've got a responsibility to every young person that's coming behind me, and I can't be silent anymore. I don't care what color someone's skin is. You respect me as a human being and you get it back. But do not discount what I've lived, because that's not the way that your mind thinks.
Hope that is so profound.
Absolutely.
From also, and I can relate to it so well from the perspective of the white person. Don't let another generation of white people believe what they've believed, not listen, not talk. Thank you. That's very useful. You're reminding me I need to call up my nephew and have a talk. So wonderful suggestions to walk together, be open and transparent in conversation, and really listen to each other, to be patient, to get to know our neighbors. It seems so simple, and yet it's so difficult. Dania, could you just offer us a little reflection as we close out this very rich conversation?
First of all, I do want to thank all of the panelists for sharing and for your honesty and your transparency. All that we asked for in the beginning was that we would be able to establish an atmosphere where we could exchange honestly some of our deepest hurts and some of our highest hopes. And I think we've gone a long way to accomplishing that. And I want to thank each of you for your honesty. I do believe that the only path forward is with finding partners. I reflect on the struggle last summer and what they call civil unrest, but I actually call cultural revolution last summer. Anybody would tell you, anybody that could see what happened on January 6th would have to admit that had those been simply Black kids, Black mothers, and Black fathers in that most recent past administration, there would have been a Holocaust and murder of untold dimensions. What prevented that from happening was that there was what they were calling walls of moms, middle-aged white moms, middle-aged white spots. There were walls of veterans. There were people that came together to stand against the injustice that was intended, and the evil that was intended upon the folks that were simply walking the street. And when a person that's walking the street is more threatening than a person that's walking the halls of Congress threatening to kill the vice president, then there's something obviously wrong. And I believe that partnerships begin with conversation. And I want to thank each of you for allowing us to, in your sharing, to adding to that conversation. And this is just the beginning. I look forward to all of you working with you, and that dynamo that's sitting there, she's the third one from my box. If I put Jalen and Michelle in the room together, we get something done. But I just want to thank you for sharing, and Kate, I want to thank you for all you've done to make this work, to make this happen as well as the Alliance in Charlotte. But that's my two pieces.
I'd like to say some concluding remarks since we've reached our time. And I do also want to thank all of you for a very stimulating conversation. But I want to comment on a few things. It's easy to say use the word patience when you're young. But for those of us who are well into our 80s, we've been patient for a long time. And for those of us who have multi-generational stories to tell, 400 years has been a long time. And patience is another delaying tactic. And we don't have another 400 years. As I said in my original remarks, if we keep up the racism, both the individual and the systemic racism, we will not only destroy ourselves and each other, we destroy this country and all the potential that this country has. I want to commend Michelle for saying it's up to me. And it is up to, and I think Jalen's remarks pointed that also, we all have a job to play. But I do think, and I said it originally, we did not create this social construct and we cannot uncreate it. The authors, the owners of racism have to work the hardest on eliminating racism. We need more Black voices. And I think some of you commented on that. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to say that the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice has initiated a newsletter called Black Voices. And it is a sexist counting newsletter. And what we want to not only continue the conversation through speaking to the whole community, Black and white, we want to hear from the Black voices in this community. One of you said, our voices have to be in the boardroom. Well, it's not that we don't want to be in the boardroom, it's but we have not been invited. We have major industries. We have a real estate industry where we're not represented. We actually have schools where 13% of the children are Black and there are no Black teachers. We have boards throughout Sussex County where there is no representation. We have to ask for that, we have to demand that, and we have to vote towards that end. We are a major part of Delaware, and yet we have no Black representation in the General Assembly. The total representation for this county in our General Assembly is white. Not saying there's anything wrong with that, except your voice isn't there to tell your story, to make your demands. So think about that when you vote. Think about that when you're being active. And again, let me see, did I have any more comments? Except that your Black voice is very important, and I hope we will hear it in our newsletter. And that we will share your stories and we will share your questions. We're going to send out a survey after this very important town hall. And we'd like you to respond and tell us how you felt about it. What are the issues? What are the issues that were not discussed? The Alliance can proudly say for 5 years, we have had town hall meetings to have this conversation. If God allows, we will have 5 more years and maybe 50 more. Yes. We are not going to stop with the conversation. It has to continue. But the conversation is not a bunch of Black folks sitting around having a conversation. Most of them say, we can't tell each other anything we don't know. The conversation has to be with white folks. With that in mind, I invite you, and you can invite your friends, to join the Alliance so you can join the conversation. Go to our website. It's a very simple, very inexpensive membership, and you don't even have to join. We'd rather you be members and support us financially, but you can just join us and get all of our information and join our dialogue to action groups where the conversation is even more specific. So I hope we will continue this conversation. One of the things I was curious about, and I think one of the chat room comments said it, the experiences of all of you, especially our white panelists, were very informative, but I didn't get a sense of the racism that you observed or experienced at that major level. And perhaps that's because once something is the norm, we don't recognize that it is racism, that it is dangerous, that it is debilitating. So I hope as we proceed with the conversation, we will get that. I have said enough, I know. I thank all of you, especially our wonderful moderators and our wonderful panelists. And I hope we'll continue the conversation for the next 5 years.
Yes.
Thank you, and good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Calvin.